Will a message go out on the back of what's happening in Sri Lanka that this embrace with the dragon could prove deadly? Would, according to you, Meera Shankar, countries that are part of the BRI initiative, especially those who are in India's immediate neighborhood, realize the follies of China's debt-fueled support and the kind of problems that can create? Or do you think that they're too far down that path to now be able to course correct?
Well, it can act as a cautionary tale in terms of how much exposure those countries want to have to Chinese debt. For instance, you see Bangladesh, they have been quite conscious of this.
Correct, absolutely.
And they say that they have paid for instance, some of the projects which China has done through their own money rather than taking debt from China. And they've turned down several projects. I think in Nepal also, there would be some concern because the Nepalese, of course, are nowhere near either Sri Lanka or Pakistan in terms of the foreign debt crisis that they face. But they've been taking stock and seeing how they could be more prudent in managing this issue, because tourism has declined even for Nepal, and therefore to look at how they are going to balance this pressure on their balance of payments is something that the government is taking very seriously. In Pakistan, the new government has had to grapple with the consequences of the debt, though they are not so badly off as Sri Lanka, because they still have fuel and they also grow their own food. They don't have a food crisis of the nature that Sri Lanka faces. Nevertheless, their foreign exchange situation is quite dire, and they are having to negotiate with the IMF on a package to bail them out.
And Ambassador Kanta, the fact is earlier, a lot of these countries thought IMF packages are problematic because there are conditions attached. The help from China seemed more lucrative because it was apparently at lower interest rates for longer periods without any political or economic conditionalities. But ultimately, the folly of that thinking is revealed. What's your sense of how close Pakistan is to a similar collapse as Sri Lanka? And the same question that I asked Ambassador Shankar about whether this will make countries more wary, and if in this mess there is a diplomatic opportunity for India, and how should the mandarins in the MEA try and navigate these choppy waters?
You know, when it comes to Sri Lanka, as I mentioned earlier, China has definitely contributed to its present economic and political predicament. Meera referred to, Chinese engagement in Sri Lanka, its BRI projects in Sri Lanka, and indeed elsewhere in our neighborhood, being a cautionary tale. Look at what happened in case of Hambantota port, where because of Sri Lankan government's inability to even service the debt, it had to hand over the port on a 99-year lease. It was nothing but an example of debt trap and its implications. Now, in current situation, as President Gotabaya Rajapaksa himself admitted in an interview to Bloomberg last month, China has not been forthcoming with support. It has not even allowed Sri Lanka to utilize a credit line of $1.5 billion, which is available because of stringent conditionalities. Sri Lankan government asked for an additional credit line of $1 billion, which is not forthcoming. So essentially, Sri Lanka has been depending on India, and it had no option but to go to IMF for support. That's another area where China was discouraging Sri Lanka from taking recourse to IMF loan. Indeed, it has been opposed to restructuring of debt, which is an essential prerequisite for IMF lending. Coming to Pakistan, as Meera pointed out, situation is perhaps not as grim as in Sri Lanka, but CPEC projects also carry a lot of vulnerabilities and baggage. And there is, unless there is course correction on part of Pakistan, it's going to land up in a very serious economic crisis, fueled at least partly by kind of a very unequal economic engagement it has gone into with China.
Thanaka Balasuriya, is there a acknowledgement in the Gotabaya government now and in the Sri Lankan political establishment about the choices made vis-a-vis China and the role that they've played in landing Sri Lanka in the mess that it is? And what's the message that you think you'd like to send as a member of the ruling party, government, to the world outside about the dangers of the kind of debt that China gives?
Well, actually, I would disagree with you there, because I don't think we have a debt issue, but I don't think it was a Chinese debt issue. It was our exposure to the debt to China was only about 10%, and we had the same exposure to debt from Japan. The large portion of the debt, and what really got us into this mess was the ISBs, which consisted about 48%. The Chinese debt is usually about 15 to 20 years, and I understand there was a mismatch between certain projects and the expected returns from those projects and the duration of the loans, and the rates tend to be about 3 to 4%. But in actuality, the ISB the rates were about, we paid from 6 to 8%. And I think during the last government, they issued 12.5 billion worth of ISBs. And then when the COVID came, what happened was the remittance decreased, and then also our remittance decreased, and also tourism suffered. Tourism suffered after the Easter attacks. So if we had there was a lot of pressure on the external sector. And as a result, we couldn't go to the international markets. The ratings got downgraded. And I certainly agree with you that certain projects, such as there was a convention hall which was built in Hambantota, should not have been built. But if you really look at it, those projects were not the main reason, I believe, that we got into this trouble.
Okay.